Dear students, welcome in the second part of Kings, Farmers and Towns. In the part 1, let's recapitulate what we have already studied. We have studied about the sources to know about the history of 6th century BC to 6th century CE. What were the sources? Rise of Mahajanpadas, Magad as most powerful Mahajanpad, early empire, that is the Mauryas, Ashoka and his policy of Dhamma, Mauryan administration was Mauryan Empire and All India Empire. Then the new notions of kingship that emerged in the post-Mauryan period. Popular perception of king according to Gandatindu Jataka. In this part, we are going to focus on these points. Strategies to increase production in agriculture, differences in rural society, land grant, urban life and trade, coins and currency, decipherment of Kharoshti and Brahmi, epigraphic and different sources which are in chapter 2 of NCERT textbook. According to Gandatindu Jataka, the popular perception of common people about the king was that king charged high taxes from them. The method was very oppressive. People were exploited by the king's ministers and his officers. Hence, to pay the taxes, one method they adopted was to increase crop production. Now, to increase crop production, what strategies were adopted? What strategies did they use? Since iron tools were there, the age was known to iron. Hence, iron implements were introduced in agriculture. And one was iron-tipped plough-share. In Gangetic plains, in the alluvial fertile soil was there, they used iron-tipped plough-share which could cultivate more than 2 crops and it increased production. Then transplantation method, that is paddy was transplanted in Gangetic plains. In the semi-arid regions of Punjab and Rajasthan, they did not adopt this technique till 20th century. In the hilly regions, they practiced hoe agriculture which could cultivate the terrain. Next, to increase the agricultural production, what was needed? Irrigation. Irrigation through wells, tanks and canals were there. Many a times when the kings constructed lakes, they used to get their names inscribed. For example, we have in the chapter Sudarshan Lake. Sudarshan Lake is in Gujarat. According to Girnar inscriptions, we come to know about the Sudarshan Lake, that it was constructed by Mauryan governor Pushyagupta and repaired by Saka ruler Rudra Daman. When this lake was being constructed, it not only provided irrigation but also construction of these lakes, reservoirs, canals provided employment to large number of people. We could see here in the image the iron implements, the tools which were used in agriculture, iron plough and transplantation method. Though it was back-breaking, that is people have to bend down, but still it increased the production. Despite the fact Various strategies were adopted to increase the agriculture, but still its benefit was not uneven. It was not benefited to entire rural population. It did not benefit. And we come to know through Buddhist stories about the growing difference among the people engaged in agriculture. Now, what were these type of people in the society? Landless agricultural laborers, small peasants were there with small holdings of land, and large landholders. The large landholders, as well as village headmen, they emerged powerful over the cultivators. Gahapati, Grihpati also we call it, in Pali means head or master of the household. Gahapati was also a rich land holder, and he gave donations. In Pali text there is a mention that many of these Gahapatis were wealthy, they were rich landholders, and they gave donations also to many of the Buddhist Sanghas. For example, in one of the texts it's there that there was a Gahapati who gave lots of cows as donation to his physician who was Jivak. Now in the South India also agriculture flourished and through Sangam text we come to know about differences on the basis of resource accessibility. There also it was not uniform. There were rich landlords or landowners who were called Velalar peasants. The Ujawar were the ploughman, and Adimai were the landless laborers who were like slaves. Differences were based on differential access to land, labor, and some of the new access to technology. Here you could see it here, Velalar peasants in South India. Next important topic is land grant. From what sources we come to know about the land grant? Many copper plates have been excavated, maybe a symbol certifying the details of the land. These copper plate inscriptions gives an insight into the land grant. In 6th century BC, that period till 6th century CE, many of the kings they made land grant like Vakatakas, the Satavahanas, the Guptas. Now why did the king make land grant? What were these land grant? Inscriptions mention that land was given to religious institutions like temple or even to Brahmin who was called Agrahara. And Agrahara is a land given to a Brahmin, and he was exempted from paying the taxes and dues to the king. When Brahmin he completed his education in the Gurukul system and returned back to his village to start his Girhasthashram, a life, married life, many of the kings, they granted land, they donated the land to the Brahmins. The main purpose was to bring the virgin land or the land which was not cultivated to increase the cultivation, to increase the productivity, to bring it under cultivation. Secondly, some historians also say that at that time, to weaken the power of the feudal lords, the kings, perhaps to make allies as these Brahmins, they used to donate or they used to grant land. And it was one of the strategy to increase agriculture area under cultivation, as I mentioned right now, that these Brahmins, they brought the virgin land under cultivation and integrated the rural population into the economic framework. And also the kings to win their allies and strengthen their political power, to project themselves as supermen, that they are superior with and have some authority, and to reduce the power of the Samans. From one of the inscriptions, we come to know about Prabhavati Gupta. In those days, according to Manusmriti, we are going to study in kinship, caste and class, women had no general access to their father's property. But there was an exception. Women of upper class, they owned their father's property. Prabhavati Gupta, she was the daughter of King Vikramaditya II, Vikramaditya or Chandragupta II, and Kuber Nag. She was married to Vakataka ruler Rudrasen II. Her husband died and she also ruled the kingdom of the husband on behalf of her minor sons. And she has granted land to a Brahmin. And the Brahmin, it's a source in your book, it is also there, that Prabhavati Gupta, from the land grant inscription, we come to know that she had granted the land to a Brahmin who was exempted from paying various dues and taxes. We'll discuss about it in the sources. Copper plate inscriptions. Mostly these inscriptions did not get damaged. That's why in the copper plate inscriptions it was inscribed so that the kings wanted that the coming generation should know about the land grant. Now, towns and trade. We have studied in part 1 about Mahajanpadas and the capital cities of these Mahajanpadas. There were various urban centers. Most of the Mahajanpadas and its capital cities, almost all, were the urban centers. For example, urban population, elites and craftsperson. There was trade in subcontinent and beyond. And next we will be reading about the coins and kings. On map, I could show you here the various urban centers. Now, which were the new cities? Patliputra, the capital city of the Mauryans, of the Magad. It was on the river route. Already in part 1 we have discussed about Patliputra. Ujjaini in Avanti, it was in the land route town. Puhar, sea route near the coast. And Mathura emerged as commercial, cultural and political activities center. Now about the urban population, elites and the craftsperson. Elites like kings, they lived in fortified cities. Many of the areas could not be excavated because it was difficult to conduct extensive excavation as it was densely populated and people live in these areas even today. Then a wide range of artifacts were excavated, which includes fine pottery bowls, dishes, tools, weapons, vessels, figurines. As I mentioned in the previous part about the northern black polished ware, which was used by the rich people, has been excavated and has been found in Gangetic plains. Then figurines were made up of wide range of materials like gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, glass, shell and terracotta. By the 2nd century BCE, we find votive inscriptions. Now, what were the votive inscriptions? These votive inscriptions were, in fact, it was inscribed what was donated by the wealthy merchants to the religious institution. Voting means offering to a deity. Mostly when a merchant returned after a successful expedition from the sea, After the trade, they used to give donations to the religious institution that was called the votive inscriptions. And from votive inscriptions, we come to know various occupations like weavers, blacksmiths, goldsmiths, merchants, traders, potters, and carpenters. Then also there was guilds or organization of craftspersons and merchants mentioned as well. These guilds probably procured raw materials, regulated production, and marketed the finished product. It is likely that craftspersons used a wide range of iron tools to meet the growing demands of urban cities. You could see here the sculpture, the pottery, and the northern black polished ware with a glossy finish. Now there was a flourishing trade. Not only this, there was a flourishing trade. From 6th century BCE onwards, land and river routes crisscrossed the subcontinent and extended in various directions, overland into Central Asia and beyond, and overseas from the ports that dotted the coastline, that is, from the coastal ports, extending across Arabian Sea to East and North Africa and West Asia, and through the Bay of Bengal to South Asia, East Asia and China. Rulers often controlled these routes, possibly by offering protection for a price, that is, they used to take taxes from the people. If they protected it, those who traversed these routes were peddlers who probably travelled on foot and merchants who travelled with caravans of bullock carts and pack animals. Then there were seafarers whose ventures were risky but highly profitable. Successful merchants, designated as Masatuvan in Tamil and Settis and Satavahas in Prakrit, could become enormously rich. They were the rich merchants. A wide range of goods was carried from one place to another, like salt, grain, cloth, metal stores, finished products, stone, timber, medicinal plants, and others. Spices, especially pepper, were in high demand in the Roman Empire as textiles and medicinal plants, and all these were transported across the Arabian Sea. Now the coins and kings. Numismatics. Numismatics is the study of ancient coins issued by various kings. So far we have read about the flourishing trade, various occupations of the people, the industries, various coins which were found in the excavations. It throws light on the economy of the period. How does coins throws light on the economy of the period? It indicates that there was a flourishing trade and industries also flourished. Exchange of goods took place through the coinage. Earlier, trade was done through barter system, and cowries or shells were the medium of exchange. But it was from the period of Mahajanpadas, we could find the punch-marked coins. What were these punch-marked coins? They were stamped or punched with specific ruling dynasties, like of the Mauryas. In the Mauryan period, punch-marked coins of copper and silver was found. In Magad, it was of silver, but in the Mauryan period, it was of copper and silver. The silver punch-marked coins was known as silver karsh pana. The coins had inscriptions, pictorial representations, which was issued by the kings. Now, use of circulation of first gold coins in India was by the Kushan kings. When the Kushans, who were Indo-Greeks, they came, they issued the gold coins, identical in weight to those issued by the contemporary Roman emperors. They, from the coins which was found of that period, we could see on one side there was image of Greek gods, and on the other side of the coin it was of the emperor. All these indicates of the flourishing trade, flourishing economy of the period. Then historians also suggest that India had a link with Roman through trade. How do we know about the Roman? That India had a trade with relations with Rome, as hoards of Roman coins were found. The hoards of Roman coins have been found, and especially in the ports of South India like Puhar. That is, South India had connections with the Roman Empire. With the coming of the Guptas, coins of gold, silver and copper was found. For example, Chandragupta Kumaradevi type of coin, that is Chandragupta I married Lichavi princess Kumaradevi, and both their image is on the coins. It is through the coins of Samudragupta we come to know that about his military expeditions. So coins found in Gupta period indicates of the economy had flourished at that period. Then hoards of lead coin molds have been found in Rohtak, Haryana in excavations, which indicates that lead and copper coins were issued by tribal republics such as Yahudeyas of Punjab and Haryana. All these tells us about the long distance transactions from which kings were also benefited. From 6th century CE onwards, there was a decline in the use of the Roman coins. It tapered off, means gradually decreased. Various assumptions by the historians. Few historians say that probably it was due to the collapse of Western Roman civilization, the trade declined. While few historians say, no, it's not true. Alternative new trade routes, the new towns developed at that time. Hence, we cannot say that it tapered off. New networks of trade started emerging at that time. They also point out that though the finds of coins of that time are fewer, coins continue to be mentioned in inscriptions and in the text. Now again historians have a question. Could it be that there are fewer finds because coins were in circulation rather than be hoarded? Through the coins from 6th century BC to 6th century CE, the use of coins extensive, we come to know that economy flourished at that period. Trade was there, long distance trade was there, industries were there, and all these, it not only benefited the emperor, the kings, but also to the people. We could see here the images of the coins, punch-marked coins. Symbols were punched or stamped into the metal surface. Yahudeya coin of Indo-Greek king Menander, and here silver Karshpanna or the punch-marked coins of the Mauryan period. Then Roman gold coins, the coin of the Kushans, and Guptas, as I mentioned, Kumaradevi, Chandragupta type of coin. Now back to the basics. Next topic, how are inscriptions deciphered? how Brahmi was deciphered, Kharoshti was read. What historical evidence do we get from these? Brahmi script, as already mentioned earlier, it was used in most of Ashokan inscriptions. From the late 18th century, European scholars aided by Indian Pandits worked backwards from contemporary Bengali and Devanagari manuscripts and also assumed inscriptions to be in Sanskrit, although were in Prakrit. After several investigations, it is James Princip, about whom we have studied I have mentioned in part 1, who deciphered Brahmi. Kharoshti script. Kharoshti script was used in northwest. In the northwestern part, this script was used. Indo-Greek kings' coins have also been found inscribed in Greek and Kharoshti. European scholars compared the letter who could read the Greek. For example, the symbol of A was used in both scripts for writing the name of Apollo, Dotus, and James Princip identified the language of Kharoshti as Prakrit, and it became possible to read inscriptions as well. Ashoka is mentioned with different names in inscriptions like Devanam Piya, beloved of gods, Piyadasi, pleasant to behold. And after examining all these, we come to know that king was none other than King Ashoka. We could see here Ashoka, how Brahmi, they could decipher it, the Brahmi and Kharoshti script. Now, again a question arises in your mind also it must be arising, that does epigraphy alone can reconstruct the history? Are inscriptions sufficient enough to provide evidence? Or what historical evidence do we get from inscriptions of the period 6th century BCE to 6th century CE? To find out how epigraphists and historians work, we take an example of two of the Ashokan inscriptions and examine. The name of the ruler Ashoka is not mentioned in the inscription. What is used are the titles adopted, like Devanam Piya, and often translated as beloved of gods, and Piyadasi or pleasant to behold. The name Ashoka is mentioned in some other inscription which also contain these titles. After examining all these inscriptions and finding they match in terms of content, style, language and paleography, epigraphists have concluded they were issued by the same rulers. It was noticed that Ashoka claims that earlier rulers had no arrangements to receive reports like Pativedakas we have in the source. Ashoka had efficient espionage system, and he mentions that earlier rulers did not have such an efficient system to receive the reports. Hence, what all these explains, what do we conclude from it? That if a king's orders, historians have to continuously assess the statements made in inscription to judge whether they are true, whether Ashoka's statement was true or not. Historians, they continuously assessed. They sometimes add these to make the meaning of the sentence clear, and which has to be done carefully. Now historians have to make other assessment as well. If a king's orders were inscribed on natural rocks near the cities or important routes of communication, did the passers-by could read, whether they could read or they could understand the language? Apart from it, various other problems that could arise, that is, in present day Ashoka, in one of the sources, anguish of the king has been mentioned. But whatever the inscriptions were there in Orissa, none of the inscriptions mention anguish of the conquest. Might be that it was too painful for the king to use the word anguish. Hence, epigraphy alone could not reconstruct the history. Many of the letters are missing. It is faintly engraved. It's missing whatever has been found in the excavations. It is missing letters, then not clear to be translated or to be published. Many of the inscriptions are damaged. Then many inscriptions, they just mentioned about the significant happening in the kingdom, about the praise of the king or in queen like Prayag Prashasti or Samudragupta Allahabad pillar inscription, that is about the praise of the king Samudragupta. But inscriptions do not mention the joy or the sufferings of the common people. Hence, inscriptions also could not be properly deciphered, as many of it is damaged. Letters are faintly engraved. Some of letters are missing. Therefore, epigraphy alone cannot reconstruct the history. It, as I mentioned right now, in the praise of king or significant political incident, doesn't mention joy and sorrow of ordinary people, and it reflects the perspective of the person who writes. You could see here about the inscriptions which is there. The various sources are there. Few important sources I have taken from the your textbook, chapter 2 of NCERT. One is from the account of Megasthenes, of the great officers of the state. Various questions which can come, I framed it, from where the excerpt has been taken. Who was Megasthenes? He was the Greek ambassador, Megasthenes, and it has been taken from his account. Indica. Then two sources to know about the Mauryas. What did the king's officials do? You will get the answer. Then about the Mauryan army, it is there, the Arthashastra lays down, and Greek sources also mentions about the Mauryan army. And various questions which can come, I framed it from where the source has been taken. Name the Greek historian who has described about Mauryan army. Why did Mauryans had vast army? What resources they needed for the maintenance of army? Write two features of Mauryan army. Source 3 about the Pandya chief and chiefdoms. What do you understand by a chief? And write the names of 3 important chiefdoms of South India. How did people welcome chief in this source? What gift did they bring for him? How did chief use his gifts? Source 4 is from Prayag Prashasti, which was written by court poet of Samudragupta. It's Allahabad pillar inscription. What is Prashasti? Who composed Prayag Prashasti? Who was Samudragupta? With which god he is equated? Write 2 sources to know about the Guptas. Then Girnar inscription about Sudarshan Lake, built by a Mauryan governor and repaired by a Shaka ruler, Rudradaman. Where is Sudarshan Lake? How do we come to know about this lake? Who got it constructed? Who repaired it? When the lake was constructed, how did it benefit the people? Source 6 is on land grant, Prabhavati Gupta, and the village of Dangona, that she states in her inscriptions. It was inscribed in the 13th ruling year of the queen. Who was Prabhavati Gupta? Why did kings made land grant in that period? What was Agrahara? Why is this source important? Source 7 is King Devanam Piyadasi about the Kalinga War. It is the Pativedakas about the reporters of the king. What do you understand by King Devanam Piyadasi? Which king is mentioned here? Who were Pativedakas? What function did they perform? In your opinion, how they were different from reporters today? Then about the anguish of the king, Devanam Piyadasi, that is King Ashok, how he adopted Buddhism after the Kalinga. Which war transformed King Ashoka and why? What was his policy of Dhamma? Which officers were appointed to spread messages of Dhamma? Thank you for listening to my session. If you liked my class, please like and subscribe it.